She said, "My sister's moving in next week, and that's not up for discussion." It wasn't said during a fight or some emotional breakdown. She said it casually, like she was telling me the trash pickup schedule had changed. We were sitting at the small kitchen table in the apartment we'd shared for almost 2 years. The one we picked together, signed together, and split exactly down the middle every month. I didn't answer right away because I honestly thought I'd misheard her. I asked who she meant. She repeated it, slower, with a tone that suggested the conversation was already over. Her younger sister had broken up with her boyfriend, quit her job, and needed a place to reset. I asked when this had been decided. She said they'd been talking about it for a while and that she assumed I'd be okay with it because it was temporary. No dates, no endpoint. Just a suitcase showing up and a third adult moving into a two-bedroom apartment. I told her I wasn't comfortable with that. The apartment wasn't big. I worked from home most days. The spare room was my office, the space I paid for and relied on. We'd had explicit conversations when we moved in that no one else would live with us unless we both agreed. She shrugged and said, "It's my sister. I'm not choosing you over family." That was the moment the tone shifted. She framed it like a loyalty test, not a shared decision. I said this wasn't about choosing. It was about consent, boundaries, and shared space. She rolled her eyes and told me I was being dramatic and selfish. She reminded me that her name was on the lease too, like that alone gave her veto power. Then she added, "If you really loved me, you'd support me instead of making this about yourself." I asked if her sister would contribute to rent or utilities. She laughed, not politely, but dismissively, like the question itself was offensive. She said, "Of course not. She's going through a hard time." That's when the situation stopped being theoretical. Higher utility bills, less space, someone else in the kitchen, the bathroom, the living room, all day while I worked. My office gone, my routine disrupted, and I'd still be paying half of everything. I asked how long temporary meant. She said, "We'll see," and then told me not to push her because it stressed her out. There was no plan, no accountability, just an expectation that I'd absorb the inconvenience quietly. I reminded her that this wasn't what we agreed to when we moved in. She said plans change and people adapt. Then she said it again, slower and sharper, like a warning. Her sister was moving in next week, and if I made it a problem, she'd remember that. That line stayed with me. Not the move-in, not the money, the threat wrapped in memory. I stopped arguing, not because I was conceding, but because I was already switching gears. I asked practical questions instead. Where would her sister sleep? She said the spare room, my office. She suggested I could work from the bedroom or go to a cafe if it bothered me. That night I slept on the couch. Not as a statement, I just didn't want to lie next to someone who had already decided my input didn't matter. The next morning while she was at work, I reread the lease. Both our names were on it. No subletting without written consent from all tenants. No long-term guests beyond 14 days without approval. When I mentioned that later, she snapped and accused me of turning this into a legal thing over her sister. She said if I was going to act like that, maybe I should rethink the relationship. I told her I already was. The next few days were quiet in a way that wasn't calm, just tense and unresolved. She acted like the decision was already settled, and any discomfort I felt was my personal issue to manage. She talked about her sister's arrival like it was a minor schedule adjustment, not a fundamental change to how we lived. I tried once more to have a straightforward conversation. I told her this wasn't about disliking her sister. It was about being excluded from a decision that directly affected my space, my work, and my finances. She didn't engage with that. She said I was overanalyzing everything and making it bigger than it needed to be. When I asked again about a timeline, she said I was being controlling. When I asked about contributions, she said money wasn't the point. When I brought up the lease terms, she accused me of hiding behind paperwork instead of being supportive. Every concern I raised got reframed as a character flaw. If I wanted clarity, I was rigid. If I wanted boundaries, I was cold. If I wanted consent, I was selfish. At one point, she said, "You're acting like this apartment is more important than our relationship." I told her that wasn't fair. The apartment wasn't the issue. The way the decision was made was. She shook her head and said I was missing the bigger picture. According to her, partners make sacrifices. Good partners don't keep score. That was when I realized nothing I said would land. In her version of events, the move-in was already justified, and my role was to adapt quietly. There was no scenario where she reconsidered, compromised, or even paused. 2 days before her sister was supposed to arrive, she started clearing out the spare room. She moved my desk against the wall and stacked my equipment in boxes without asking. When I came home and saw it, something settled in me. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I just asked her to stop touching my things. She told me to relax and said she was doing me a favor by organizing. That night I stayed late at a friend's place and thought through the situation step by step. Not emotionally, practically. The lease allowed no additional residents without consent. We split rent evenly. I paid my half on time, every time. I didn't owe anyone flexibility at the cost of my own stability. The next morning I told her I wouldn't be living with a third person I hadn't agreed to. I didn't ask her to cancel anything. I just stated my position. She said, "So, what, you're going to leave over this?" I said yes. She stared at me like I'd said something ridiculous. She said I was being extreme and that I'd regret throwing everything away over something temporary. I told her I wasn't throwing anything away. I was stepping out of a situation where my consent didn't matter. She said if I left, I was still responsible for my half of the rent. I told her I'd cover my obligations according to the lease, but I wouldn't fund an extra adult living there. That's when she got angry. Not loud, but sharp. She said I was abandoning her when she needed me. I told her I wasn't abandoning anyone. I was refusing to be overridden. I packed a bag that afternoon. Clothes, laptop, documents. I left the rest untouched. I transferred my half of the rent early and sent her a message confirming it was my final payment, unless we formally renegotiated the lease. I stayed with a friend that night. By the time I woke up the next morning, I had 3 missed calls and a text that said her sister was already on her way. That was the first real consequence, and it hadn't even fully landed yet. Final update. I didn't go back to the apartment after I left, and I didn't announce that decision either. I just stopped showing up. I stayed with a friend the first week, then another, and eventually started looking for a place of my own. I wasn't avoiding a conversation. There was nothing left to negotiate. Her sister moved in the same day I left. I know that because the shared utility account sent automatic notifications to my phone before I had a chance to remove myself from it. Electricity usage jumped immediately. Water followed. Internet traffic doubled overnight. It was the first concrete signal that the situation had changed exactly the way I'd expected. 2 days later, she texted me asking if we could revisit things calmly. She said the tension had been a lot and that her sister was still settling in, but it wasn't as bad as I thought it would be. She suggested I come by to see for myself. I didn't reply. A week after that, she emailed me screenshots of the lease with highlighted sections about shared responsibility. I answered once, briefly, citing the clause about additional residents and confirming that my payments were complete through my move-out date. No explanation, no defense, just facts. That's when the tone shifted. Her messages stopped sounding confident and started sounding careful. She asked if I could help just until things stabilized. She said her sister was having trouble finding work and that money was tighter than she expected. I declined and reminded her that she made the decision independently. I didn't block her. I didn't argue. I just stayed consistent. Over the next month, I heard updates through mutual friends without asking. Her sister treated the apartment like a crash pad, slept late, stayed up late, took over the living room, used my old office space as storage. None of it was malicious. It was exactly what happens when someone moves in with no structure and no stake. By the second month, rent became a real problem. Utilities were higher. Groceries disappeared faster. My ex reached out again and asked if I could cover part of the rent one last time so they wouldn't fall behind. I said no, calmly, clearly. She told people I'd abandoned her, that I chose money over love, that I walked away instead of supporting her when things got hard. I didn't correct the story. Anyone who knew me well enough already understood what happened. The reality was simpler than the version she told. She made a unilateral decision that affected my space, my work, and my finances. When I didn't accept it quietly, she treated my refusal as disloyalty. When I enforced the boundary, she treated it as cruelty. About 3 months in, She had to ask her parents for help. They covered 1 month of rent. After that, her sister moved out and stayed with a friend. The temporary situation ended the same way it began, abruptly and without planning. By then, I was already gone in every sense that mattered. I'd signed a lease on a small one-bedroom closer to work. Quiet, predictable, no shared decisions, no negotiations about my space. She reached out once more after her sister left. She said she missed me and that things would be different now, that she finally understood how much pressure she'd put on me. I read the message and didn't respond. There was no final argument, no dramatic ending, just distance becoming permanent. I didn't punish her. I didn't teach her a lesson. I didn't need to. I simply stopped participating the moment my consent stopped mattering. Everything that followed unfolded without my involvement, exactly as it needed to.